Hi everyone, welcome to my channel. Tonight we travel to the damp green hills of Ayrshire, Scotland, where the air smells of peat smoke and wet wool, and a boy is about to watch the world he knows come apart. Picture it. Mist clings low over the fields near Elderslie, and a farmhouse sits quiet in the grey dawn, smoke curling thin from its chimney. Inside, a young William Wallace sleeps beneath a rough blanket, unaware that history is about to reach into his home and take something from him. And here is what you have to understand. In this Scotland, there is no safety in staying small. Even a modest farming family, minding its own fences and its own cattle, cannot hide from the ambitions of a king across the border. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. If you are watching from somewhere far from these misty hills, drop your location and your local time in the comments. I like knowing where in the world tonight's listeners are curled up. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The late 1200s are a cruel decade to be Scottish. The King of Scots has died without a clear heir, and into that vacuum strides Edward I of England, a towering iron-willed monarch. The English call Longshanks for his unusual height, and the Scots will soon call something far less flattering. Edward is invited at first merely to arbitrate the succession dispute. He does not leave as an arbitrator. He leaves as a conqueror in waiting, and slowly, methodically, he tightens his grip on Scottish castles, Scottish courts, and Scottish pride. Young Wallace grows up inside this tightening fist. His father, Malcolm Wallace, is a minor landholder, not a great lord, not a man of court intrigue, just a farmer with sons, and a temper that flares when injustice walks too close to his door. And injustice walks close often. English garrisons occupy castles that once flew Scottish banners. English officials collect taxes with a heavier hand than any Scottish king ever dared. The countryside simmers, and boys like young Wallace absorb that, simmering the way a field absorbs rain quietly, deeply, until the ground can hold no more. Here is the striking historical fact worth sitting with. Wallace himself does not appear in reliable records until he is already a grown man leading armies. Almost everything about his childhood comes down to us through later chroniclers and legends stitched together generations after his death. Historians still argue over how much of the boyhood story is memory, and how much is myth built backward from the legend he became. But the emotional core, a family bruised by occupation, a boy shaped by resentment, simmering under English rule, that much fits comfortably with everything we know of the era. And now the scene that legend insists upon, the one that every storyteller from his own century onward could not resist telling. English soldiers arrive at the Wallace farmstead demanding fish that Malcolm and his household have caught from the local waters. It should be a small, forgettable exchange. It is not. Words are exchanged. Tempers rise. Steel is drawn on one side or the other, the details blur depending on which telling you trust, and Malcolm Wallace, the boy's father, is killed. Try to sit inside that moment with young William. One instant the world runs on its ordinary rhythm, chores, cattle, the small irritations of daily life under occupation. The next instant his father lies dead in the mud, killed by men who consider Scottish lives a minor inconvenience to their orders. There is no funeral procession here, no grand ceremony, just grief, cold and immediate, in a farmyard that suddenly feels much larger and much emptier than it did that morning. Here is the quirky detail that rarely makes it into the grand cinematic version of this story. In several of the earliest surviving accounts, it is not the killing of his father alone that lights the fuse in young Wallace, but a string of smaller humiliations that follow: English soldiers mocking Scottish dress, English clerks refusing to speak Gaelic-inflected Scots without sneering small, daily indignities piling one on top of another like stones in a wall. Grief alone might have made him mournful. It is the accumulation of contempt that seems to make him dangerous. The family scatters in the aftermath. Some accounts have young Wallace sent to live with an uncle, a clergyman, who teaches him Latin, teaches him French, teaches him the kind of learning most farmers' sons never touch. It is a curious detail worth picturing clearly. A boy who will become famous for raw, brutal warfare is in these formative years, just as often bent over a manuscript, tracing foreign words by candlelight. Scotland's future rebel leader is for a time simply a studious nephew in a quiet parish house absorbing not just grievance but language law and the patient discipline of the written word. But peace of that kind cannot hold. Around him Edward's occupation deepens. Scottish nobles bend the knee one by one, some willingly, some at sword point, all of them signing their names to documents that strip away what little independence remains. The English call it settlement. The Scots, who still remember their dead, call it something closer to theft. And somewhere in the hills, a young man who has buried his father and swallowed years of small humiliations begins quietly to change. Not yet the legend, not yet the outlaw whose name will make English commanders lose sleep. Just a young Scot watching his country bend, wondering how long a man can watch before he decides he would rather break. The mist has not lifted from Ayrshire yet, and neither, you sense, has the anger. The wind off the North Sea carries the smell of smoke long before Berwick comes into view, and that smell is the first sign that something terrible has already happened here. Edward I does not do things by half measures. When the town of Berwick, Scotland's wealthiest trading port, a jewel of commerce and shipping, resists his authority, he answers not with negotiation but with annihilation. In the spring of 1396, his army storms the town's defences, and what follows is a massacre so severe that chroniclers on both sides struggle to agree on numbers, though even the more conservative estimates run into the thousands. Men, women, and by some accounts children are cut down in the streets, in their homes, in the harbour, where they had hoped the water might offer escape. And here is what you have to understand: this is not incidental cruelty. This is a message deliberately sent to every other town in Scotland still weighing whether to resist. Picture the aftermath. Smoke hangs low over the rooftops. The harbour, once busy with merchant ships trading wool and hides across the North Sea, now sits eerily still, the water lapping against hulls, with no one left to load them. Survivors pick through rubble, searching for family members among the dead. Word of what happened at Berwick does not stay in Berwick. It travels the length of Scotland on the tongues of terrified refugees, and it does exactly what Edward intends. Castle after castle surrenders without a fight. Town after town opens its gates rather than share Berwick's fate. This is the moment the English chroniclers begin calling Edward the Hammer of the Scots, a nickname he will carry into legend, carved eventually onto his own tomb. It is meant as praise from his own people. In Scotland it lands very differently, less a title of honour than a description of exactly what has been done to their nation, flattened, battered, reshaped by force. The striking historical fact here deserves a moment of stillness. Within a matter of months, after Berwick, nearly the entire Scottish nobility, the earls, the barons, the men who might have led resistance, submit formally to Edward's authority. Historians call the resulting document the Ragman Roll, a long parchment scroll bearing the seals and signatures of Scotland's elite, each one swearing loyalty to the English crown. Some sign out of genuine fear after Berwick's example. Some sign because they see no realistic alternative. Whatever their reasons, the effect is the same. Scotland's traditional leadership, the men, ordinary people, might once have looked to for protection, kneel almost as one, and here is the quirky detail, one that tends to surprise people who imagine medieval submission as purely solemn and ceremonial. The Ragman Roll gets its unusual name from the sheer, almost absurd bulk of dangling seals hanging off the bottom of the parchment, dozens upon dozens of wax pendants, swinging from ribbons so numerous and so chaotic-looking that later, generations joke, it resembles a ragged, tangled mess rather than a dignified state document. Some etymologists trace our modern word rigmarole, meaning a long, tedious, and confusing procedure, back to this very scroll. A moment of grim historical irony, then, that the document symbolizing Scotland's total subjugation may have gifted the English language a word for pointless bureaucratic nonsense. But not everyone signs. Not everyone bends. Down in the countryside, away from the great halls where earls scratch their names onto parchment, ordinary Scots absorb Berwick's lesson differently. They see not a reason to submit, but a reason to hate. Every burned barn, every widow, every child who watched a father die in that harbour becomes a small ember of resentment, and embers given enough time and enough wind have a habit of finding each other. Wallace, now grown into a broad-shouldered young man, with a reputation already forming for size and temper, watches this unfold from the margins. Not a lord, not a knight, not anyone whose name appears on the ragman roll, because men like him are never asked to sign such things. Their submission is assumed, taken for granted beneath the notice of kings. And there is a strange, dark freedom in that. The nobles who signed now carry an oath binding their hands. Wallace carries nothing. No signature, no promise, no seal pressed into wax swearing loyalty to Longshanks. Here, then, is the dry wit worth allowing after so much horror. Edward I, for all his brilliance as a conqueror, makes one crucial miscalculation at Berwick. He assumes that terrifying the nobility into submission means terrifying the nation into submission. He forgets, or perhaps simply does not care, that Scotland's soul was never really housed in castles and parchment seals. It was housed in villages like the one where a farmer's son buried his father. And villages, unlike earls, do not sign documents. They simply remember. Occupation tightens across the land. English garrisons settle into Scottish castles like unwelcome tenants who refuse to leave. English sheriffs begin administering Scottish justice with English law, English priorities, and increasingly English contempt. Taxes flow south. Grievances pile up like unswept ash. Somewhere in Lanarkshire, a young man is about to fall in love, marry in secret, and discover that a private life lived quietly under occupation is a fragile, dangerous thing, the kind of peace that can be shattered by a single confrontation with the wrong sheriff on the wrong afternoon. That confrontation is closer than he knows. Lanark in the late 1390s is a town trying to live an ordinary life under extraordinary pressure, and inside that ordinary life, a young woman named Marion Braveheart is about to change everything for a young man the town has started to notice. Picture the marketplace on a market day, carts loaded with wool and oats, the low murmur of Scots tongue-haggling English soldiers, stationed conspicuously at the corners, watching everything with the bored contempt of men who consider this posting beneath them. Into this scene walks Wallace, no longer the grieving farm boy of years past, but a striking figure, now tall by every account, unusually. So for his era, broad through the shoulders, with a presence that makes people glance twice. And here is what you have to understand. A man that noticeable in a town under close English surveillance cannot stay invisible for long, no matter how quietly he tries to live. He and Marion fall in love the way people do when the world outside is dangerous, and the world inside a private house feels like the only safe place left. They marry, but quietly, without the fanfare a match like theirs might otherwise draw, because drawing attention in occupied Lanark is its own kind of risk. For a brief window of time, Wallace seems to attempt something almost radical in its ordinariness, a domestic life. A wife, a home, a door he can close against the occupation outside. It does not last. The English sheriff of Lanark, a man named William de Heselrigg, represents everything the occupation has become: petty, cruel, and utterly secure in the knowledge that no Scottish farmer's son would dare challenge him directly. Accounts differ on the precise spark. Some say Wallace is set upon by English soldiers in the town and fights back, killing several before escaping. Others, the versions that became most famous in later legend, claim the confrontation turns tragic in the worst possible way. That in retaliation for Wallace's earlier defiance, Heselrigg's men move against Marion herself, and she is killed. Historians still argue over how much of this is documented fact, and how much is dramatic embellishment layered on by later chroniclers, hungry for a motive worthy of the legend Wallace was becoming. What is far better attested is what happens next. Wallace returns to Lanark under cover of darkness, and in a swift, brutal strike he kills Sheriff Heselrigg. Sit inside that night for a moment. Torches flicker along narrow streets. The sheriff, secure in his own home, surrounded by armed men who answer to him, believes himself untouchable, the way powerful men in occupied territories so often do, right up until the moment they are proven wrong. Wallace and a small band of followers move through the darkness with the kind of coordinated fury that suggests this is not a spontaneous outburst, but something planned, something that has been building for a long time behind a calm public face. By morning, Heselrig is dead and Lanark wakes to find that the occupation is for the first time in years not entirely invincible. Here is the striking mainstream historical fact worth lingering on. The killing of Heselrig in May of 1397 is generally regarded by historians as the true opening act of Wallace's rebellion, the moment he transforms from an aggrieved private citizen into an outlaw with a price on his head, and very quickly afterward a growing following of men willing to fight beside him. This is not a legend invented centuries later. Contemporary and near-contemporary records confirm that Heselrig's death at Wallace's hand becomes the spark that ignites open, organized resistance across the region. And here is the quirky detail that adds a strange texture to the horror of it. Some accounts describe the killing as done not simply with a sword, but with a passionate, almost theatrical violence. Wallace reportedly cutting the sheriff down, and in the most dramatic retellings further mutilating the body in a way meant to send an unmistakable message to every English official watching from a safer distance. Whether every gruesome flourish in these tellings is accurate hardly matters for the effect it has. Within days, the story travels far beyond Lanark's walls, growing more vivid, with every retelling exactly the way stories of vengeance tend to grow. Word spreads through the glens and market towns, the way fire spreads through dry heather, fast and impossible to fully contain. A sheriff is dead. Not an accident, not a skirmish gone wrong, but a deliberate personal act of retribution against the machinery of occupation itself. For ordinary Scots who have spent years watching their nobility sign submission after submission, this lands like something they had almost forgotten was possible. Defiance answered, not with more submission, but with a sword. And here allow a small dry note amid the blood. Sheriff Heselrig almost certainly considered himself a reasonably careful man. He had soldiers. He had walls. He had presumably every confidence that a farmer's son with a dead father and a grudge posed no serious threat to a man of his position. It is a mistake occupying officials across history have made with remarkable consistency, and it is a mistake that is about to cost the English crown a great deal more than a single sheriff. Wallace is now a hunted man, but he is no longer merely a private citizen with private grief. He is becoming something else entirely, a name people whisper with a mixture of fear and hope. Farmers begin slipping away from their fields at night. Younger sons with no land to inherit and no love for their occupiers start drifting toward the hills where rumor places him. A rebellion, small and ragged at first, is beginning to take shape around a man who buried his father, lost his wife, and decided that grief left with nowhere else to go could be forged into something far more dangerous. Smoke rises from a garrison outpost near Ayr, and the men who set it burning are already gone before English reinforcements arrive, vanished back into the hills like they were never there at all. This is the shape rebellion takes in these early months. Not a grand army, not a single decisive battle, just fire in the night ambushes on muddy roads, and a name spreading faster than any English patrol can chase it down. Picture the recruitment as it actually happens, because it is nothing like the tidy montage you might imagine. A younger son with no inheritance, coming tired of watching his family scrape by under English tax collectors, hears that Wallace is gathering men somewhere in the forest near Selkirk. He tells no one but his brother. They slip away before dawn, carrying whatever weapons a farming household can spare, a rusted blade, a hunting bow, sometimes nothing more than a sharpened farm tool. And here is what you have to understand. This is how nearly every great rebel army in history actually begins. Not with banners and trumpets, but with quiet, frightened men making the most dangerous decision of their lives in the dark, one household at a time. Wallace is not alone in this growing movement, and it would be a disservice to the truth to pretend otherwise. In the north, a young nobleman named Andrew Moray is leading a parallel uprising, striking English garrisons with startling speed and coordination. The two movements, born separately, born of different classes entirely. Moray, a nobleman's son with formal military training, Wallace, a landholder's son forged by grief and instinct, begin moving toward each other, drawn by the same gravity that pulls all rebellions toward their strongest. Available leadership. Here is the striking historical fact worth sitting with. By the summer of 1397, contemporary chroniclers describe Wallace's forces as swelling remarkably quickly, drawing not just landless younger sons, but also, in some accounts, disaffected clergy, and even some lesser nobility frustrated with Edward's heavy-handed administration. This is not merely a peasant uprising, though it is often romanticized as one. It is closer to a coalition of the aggrieved men from different corners of Scottish society who have each in their own way run out of patience with occupation. The tactics that emerge in these months are worth picturing clearly because they explain everything that follows. Wallace's men do not meet the English in open honourable battle the way chivalric tradition might expect. They cannot. They are outnumbered, under-armoured, and facing professional soldiers backed by a state treasury. Instead, they strike where English forces are weakest, a supply column moving too confidently through a narrow pass, a small garrison left thin because its commander assumed the surrounding countryside had been sufficiently terrorized into submission. Hit hard, vanish into the forest, let the land itself become a weapon. And here is the quirky, lesser-known detail that rarely survives into the more heroic tellings of this story. Several near-contemporary accounts describe Wallace's early campaign as targeting English, administrative, and financial officers, with particular focus tax collectors, clerks, the men whose job it was to extract wealth from Scotland and funnel it south. This was not simply romantic rebellion against soldiers in armour. It was in a very real sense an assault on the entire bureaucratic machinery of occupation, the paperwork, the ledgers, the quiet violence of taxation that ordinary Scots experienced far more often than they ever experienced a sword. Sheriffs across the western lowlands begin sending increasingly panicked reports south, describing a countryside slipping out of their control. Roads once considered safe for English travel now carry real risk. Merchants grumble about disrupted trade, and in castles held by English garrisons, a new and uncomfortable question begins to circulate among the officers stationed there. How precisely does one fight an enemy that refuses to stand still and be fought? There is a moment of dry humour worth allowing here, a small release after the tension of ambush and fire. English commanders, trained in the continental tradition of formal siege warfare and pitched battle, find themselves utterly baffled by opponents who simply will not cooperate with the established rules of medieval combat. One can almost picture the exasperation in their dispatches, polite, formal Latin phrasing straining to convey the sheer indignity of being harassed by men who refuse to show up where and when expected. But amid the growing momentum, tension simmers beneath the surface of the rebellion itself. Wallace, for all his rising fame, is not a nobleman. He commands respect through action, through the sheer force of what he has already done, but he lacks the traditional legitimacy that Scottish society still even now instinctively looks for in its leaders. Moray, by contrast, carries that legitimacy by birth. As their two movements draw closer together, an unspoken question hangs over every messenger sent between their camps. When these two forces finally combine, whose voice will carry more weight in the room? Neither man seems eager to force that question yet. There is too much work still to be done, too many garrisons still standing, too much of Scotland still under English boots. But somewhere to the north, word arrives that a massive English army is assembling, moving toward a river crossing near a town called Stirling, and both Wallace and Moray understand immediately what this means. The skirmishing, the ambushes, the quiet guerrilla war fought village by village, all of it has been prelude. The real test, the one that will determine whether this rebellion becomes a footnote or a legend, is about to arrive on the banks of the River Forth, and there will be no vanishing into the hills to avoid it this time. The River Forth moves slow and brown beneath a narrow wooden bridge, and on the high ground above it, Wallace stands looking down at a sight that would make most rebel commanders consider quietly retreating into the hills forever. The English army spreading across the plain below is enormous by any measure of the era. Thousands of infantry, a heavy cavalry force glinting with steel, even in the flat grey light of a Scottish September, and at its head the Earl of Surrey. A commander who has crushed rebellions before and sees. A little reason to expect this one will prove different. Picture it from Wallace's vantage point on the slopes of Abbey Craig, the ground falling away beneath him toward the water, the English tents spreading like a second town that has sprung up overnight on the far bank. And here is what you have to understand. By every conventional military logic of the age, this battle should already be lost before it begins. Beside him stands Andrew Moray, and the alliance between these two very different men has by now solidified into genuine partnership. Moray brings discipline and formal military sense. Wallace brings the raw instinct of a man who has spent a year learning through blood and improvisation exactly how the English army thinks and exactly where it is vulnerable. Together they have chosen this ground with deliberate patient care, and the choice reveals everything about how differently they intend to fight this battle compared to the disasters that have befallen other Scottish resistance before them. The bridge itself is the key to everything, and it is worth picturing its exact unglamorous dimensions because the entire coming battle hinges on a detail most people imagining medieval warfare would never think to consider. The crossing at Stirling is narrow, so narrow that by most accounts no more than 2 or perhaps 3 mounted men can cross it side by side at once. On the far side, the ground near the river is soft, marshy, hemmed in by the looping curve of the Forth itself, creating a natural bottleneck that no amount of English numerical superiority can immediately overcome. Here is the striking historical fact worth sitting with. The Earl of Surrey is offered before the battle even begins a genuine alternative. A local nobleman reportedly knows of a ford some distance upstream where a substantial cavalry force could cross the river more safely, outflanking the Scottish position entirely and rendering the narrow bridge irrelevant. Surrey, for reasons historians still debate, arrogance, impatience, poor advice from subordinates, eager to prove themselves, or simple underestimation of the ragged army watching from the hillside, declines to use it. He commits instead to sending his forces across the narrow bridge, directly into the teeth of Wallace and Moray's waiting position. Picture the English treasurer Hugh de Cressingham pacing near Surrey's tent, impatient and irritated by the cost of maintaining this army in the field a single day longer than necessary. Cressingham is by most accounts precisely the kind of official whose presence made the occupation so despised in the first place. A bureaucrat more concerned with expense reports than battlefield caution, and his impatience appears to have weighed heavily on the decision to cross without waiting for a more favourable approach. There is a small dark humour worth allowing here, a breath before the coming carnage. A war is about to be shaped in part by one man's irritation over the cost of feeding his own soldiers. And here is the quirky, lesser-known detail that rarely survives into the grander tellings of this story. Some near-contemporary accounts suggest the crossing does not even begin at a strategically sound hour, with English forces starting their advance across the narrow bridge, only to be recalled partway through the morning due to confusion in command, then sent forward again, later a stuttering, disorganized start to what should have been a carefully coordinated advance. Historians still argue over exactly how much of this hesitation reflects genuine chaos in the English camp, versus later Scottish chroniclers exaggerating enemy incompetence to flatter Wallace's eventual victory. But even accounting for exaggeration, the underlying pattern seems clear. An army that should have crossed with discipline instead crosses with uncertainty. From the high ground, Wallace watches the first English soldiers begin filing across the narrow wooden span, 2 abreast their armour, catching what thin light breaks through the clouds. Every soldier that crosses is one more man committed to a position from which retreat, should the battle turn badly, will prove nearly impossible. And here is the tension the viewer should feel building in their chest. Wallace does not order his men to attack immediately. He waits. He lets more English soldiers cross. He lets the bottleneck do its slow, patient work, allowing the enemy to file themselves unit by unit into a trap of their own making. Below, on the marshy ground near the riverbank, English cavalry and infantry continue filtering across the far bank, growing more crowded by the minute. The safety of numbers on the main field left steadily behind them. Somewhere among the waiting, Scots' nerves stretched tight as bowstrings. Men who buried fathers, lost wives, and abandoned farms for exactly this moment now watch the enemy walk unknowingly into the exact position. Wallace and Moray spent weeks choosing. The morning mist begins to burn away from the water. More English soldiers cross, and on the hillside above, Wallace finally raises his hand, watching the numbers on the far bank swell toward the precise, terrible threshold he has been waiting for, the moment when there are enough English soldiers trapped on the wrong side of that narrow bridge that the coming slaughter will be decisive, and not nearly enough room left on that marshy ground for any of them to properly fight back. The hand drops, and the hillside erupts. Wallace's men pour down from the high ground of Abbey Craig, with a speed and coordination that catches the English completely by surprise. And here is what you have to understand. This is not a disorganized peasant charge, whatever later English accounts might prefer to claim in the humiliation that follows. This is a deliberate strike, timed to the precise moment when the greatest possible number of English soldiers stand trapped on the wrong side of the river, hemmed in by marshland on one side and a narrow choked bridge on the other. Picture the chaos from inside it. English knights, still filing across the bridge, two abreast, hear the roar of the charge before they can even see its source clearly. Those already across scramble to form a defensive line on ground that offers no room to maneuver, soft, waterlogged earth that swallows hooves and slows every attempt at an organized cavalry response. The Schiltron formations Wallace's forces employed dense clusters of spearmen bristling outward like iron hedgehogs, proved devastatingly effective against cavalry, with no space to build the charging momentum that makes mounted knights so lethal on open ground. Men and horses collide with immovable walls of spear points, and the marshy field turns quickly, brutally chaotic. On the bridge itself, the scene grows even more desperate. Soldiers trying to retreat back across collide with soldiers still trying to advance the narrow span, becoming a crush of panicked men and terrified horses with nowhere to go. Some accounts describe the bridge structure itself beginning to fail under the weight and chaos, though historians still argue over whether it actually collapses during the battle or simply becomes so hopelessly congested that it might as well have. Either way, the effect is the same. The crossing that was meant to funnel English soldiers safely into position now becomes a deadly bottleneck, working entirely against them, trapping thousands on the wrong side of the water with no viable path to safety. Here is the striking historical fact worth sitting with, and it is a genuinely staggering one. Contemporary and near-contemporary estimates suggest that a substantial portion of the English force trapped south of the river, quite possibly several thousand men, is killed in the chaos, either cut down by Scottish spears or drowned, attempting to flee back across the Forth in full armour, a burden that turns the river itself into as much of a killer as any blade. For a rebellion that began as scattered farmers slipping away from their fields at night, this is a victory of a scale almost nobody on either side of the border thought possible. And here is the quirky, grimly memorable detail that tends to linger with people long after they first hear this story. Among the English dead is Hugh de Cressingham, the treasurer whose impatience helped push Surrey toward this disastrous crossing in the first place. Several chronicles, both Scottish and English, describe his body being treated with particular contempt. After the battle accounts, varying in gruesome detail depending on the source, suggest his skin was flayed, and in some tellings portions of it were kept as grim trophies, or even fashioned into small items, including, by certain retellings, a strap for Wallace's own sword belt. Historians remain divided on how literally to take these accounts, given how eagerly medieval chroniclers on both sides embellished atrocity stories to suit their own narratives. But the sheer persistence of the detail across multiple independent sources suggests that whatever happened to Cressingham's body, it was memorable enough and symbolic enough to become instant legend. There is a moment of very dark humour worth allowing here, a small release valve after so much horrific detail. A bureaucrat hated in life for squeezing every coin he could from an occupied population ends up in death, having quite literally nothing left to squeeze. Surrey himself, watching this catastrophe unfold from the far bank, apparently makes the decision that any sensible commander eventually makes when the battle has clearly irreversibly turned. He retreats, abandoning the remaining portion of Annexade, his army to its fate, and riding hard for the safety of English territory. It is not a decision that will earn him much admiration in the chronicles that follow, but it is in the most brutally practical sense the only decision left available to him. By the time the fighting finally subsides, the field below Stirling Bridge tells a story that will echo across Scotland and England alike for generations, where noble Scottish leadership, bound by oaths on the Ragman Roll, submitted meekly to occupation just a year prior. An army led by a farmer's son and a nobleman's son together has just handed Edward's forces one of the most humiliating defeats of his entire reign. Word of the victory spreads, with a speed that mirrors in reverse the terror that once spread after Berwick. Except this time, the fear runs the other direction south into England itself, where the name Wallace begins to carry weight. It never has before, but victory carries its own quiet cost, one the celebrations of that evening cannot yet fully account for. Andrew Moray, wounded in the fighting, will not recover his injuries, though not immediately fatal, prove severe enough that his health steadily declines in the weeks that follow. The partnership that made Stirling Bridge possible, the careful balance between Moray's discipline and Wallace's instinct, is about to be broken by something no English blade managed to accomplish. And Wallace, standing amid the wreckage of the greatest victory Scotland has seen in years, is about to discover that surviving a battle and surviving what comes after it are two very different kinds of struggle entirely. Andrew Moray dies in the weeks following Stirling Bridge, his wounds proving slower but no less certain than any blade that might have killed him outright. And Wallace absorbs this loss, the way he has absorbed every other loss in his life, quietly and with a hardening resolve rather than visible collapse. Picture the moment word arrives. A messenger weary from riding finds Wallace somewhere in the aftermath of victory, still organizing the scattered pieces of a rebellion that has just achieved something almost nobody believed possible. And here is what you have to understand. This is not simply the death of a comrade. Moray represented something Wallace himself could never claim by birth alone. Legitimacy. The traditional weight of noble blood that Scottish society still instinctively deferred to, even in a moment of crisis, when a farmer's son had just delivered the greatest military victory of the war. With Moray gone, that particular kind of legitimacy vanishes from the partnership entirely. And what remains is simply Wallace, a man whose authority now rests on nothing but the raw, undeniable fact of what he has already accomplished. It should not be enough. In ordinary times it would not be enough. Scottish nobility, for all its recent humiliations, still clings tightly to the old assumptions about who is fit to lead a nation, men of ancient family names, men whose fathers and grandfathers sat in councils and held titles granted by kings. Wallace holds none of these credentials, and yet in the weeks following Stirling Bridge something remarkable happens that defies the old assumptions entirely. In March of 1398, Wallace is knighted and shortly after named Guardian of Scotland, a title carrying with it the authority to govern in the name of the exiled and largely absent Scottish crown. Here is the striking historical fact worth sitting with, and it is genuinely extraordinary for the era. This is a man of relatively modest birth, being elevated to effectively rule a nation, a scenario almost unheard of in the rigidly hierarchical politics of medieval Europe. The nobility who grant him this title do so not out of any sudden embrace of egalitarian principle, but out of blunt, practical necessity. Wallace has proven on the field at Stirling that he can deliver victories no nobleman currently living has managed to achieve, and a desperate nation facing continued English aggression needs precisely that kind of proven success, far more than it needs another well-bred failure. Picture Wallace now standing in a great hall he would never have been permitted to enter, as an equal only 2 years prior, surrounded by earls and bishops who address him with titles and deference that would have been unthinkable when he pried it, was simply a landholder's son with a grudge against a dead sheriff. There is a strange, quiet tension in these scenes worth lingering on. The nobles need him respect what he has accomplished, and yet many of them have not entirely set aside the old instinct that a man like Wallace, however capable, does not quite belong among them by right. Historians still debate how genuine the nobility's support for Wallace truly runs beneath the surface courtesy, and that underlying tension will matter enormously in the difficult months ahead, as Guardian Wallace faces challenges far more complicated than anything a battlefield demands. Governing requires diplomacy, administration, the patient work of holding together a coalition of nobles who each harbour their own ambitions and grievances, many of whom resent taking orders from a man they consider, whatever his battlefield, credentials fundamentally beneath their station. And here is the quirky detail worth picturing, clearly one that rarely survives into the more heroic tellings of this story. Surviving records from Wallace's brief tenure as Guardian show him attending to remarkably mundane administrative matters, writing letters to foreign merchants in Germany and the Baltic states, reassuring them that Scottish ports remain safe for trade despite the ongoing war, actively working to keep the machinery of commerce functioning even while a hostile army waits across the border. The legendary warrior, for a brief window, spends as much time thinking about wool exports and trade guarantees as he does about swords and spears. There is a small note of dry humour worth allowing here, a breath before the tension resumes. One imagines Wallace, a man who fought his way up from a burned farmhouse to a position of national leadership through sheer battlefield brilliance, now spending his evenings drafting correspondence about the safe passage of herring shipments. Even legends, it turns out, cannot entirely escape paperwork, but this fragile arrangement of power carries within it the seeds of its own unravelling. Wallace's authority as guardian rests on continued military success and the goodwill of a nobility that granted him the position out of necessity rather than genuine conviction. Should that success falter even once, should Edward return north with an army too large and too determined to be defeated by clever positioning and a narrow bridge, the same nobles who knighted him and bent the knee to his authority may prove far less loyal than the moment currently suggests. And Edward, humiliated by the disaster at Stirling in a way no English king has been humiliated by Scottish forces in living memory, is not a man inclined to accept such a defeat quietly. Word begins reaching Scotland of English preparations on a scale far exceeding anything sent north before. Not a punitive raid, not a modest garrison reinforcement, but the beginning of a full royal campaign, with Edward himself intending to lead it in person. The Guardian of Scotland, still settling into a role he never expected to hold, is about to discover that the hardest part of this war may not have been winning Stirling Bridge at all, but surviving what Edward I intends to do in response. Smoke rises along the northern English countryside, and this time it is Scottish hands lighting the fires, not English ones. A reversal that would have seemed unthinkable only 2 years earlier when a farm boy watched soldiers burn his own family's peace to ashes. In the months following his elevation to Guardian, Wallace makes a decision that reveals something important about the kind of war he now believes must be fought. Rather than waiting passively behind Scotland's borders for Edward's inevitable retaliation, he leads a substantial force south across the border into the English counties of Northumberland and Cumberland, carrying the war onto enemy soil for the first time in this long, bitter conflict. Picture the terrain shifting as the army marches the wild highland glens, giving way to the gentler, more prosperous farmland of northern England villages and manor houses that have never known the particular terror of a foreign army moving through their fields. And here is what you have to understand. This is not simply a matter of military strategy, though the strategic logic is sound enough. Denying Edward the ability to easily resupply and stage his coming invasion from northern England, disrupting the agricultural base that would feed an English royal army, forcing English nobles to worry about their own lands rather than focusing entirely on crushing Scotland. All of this makes tactical sense. But there is something more personal woven through the campaign as well, something the chroniclers on both sides seem to sense, even if they frame it in very different terms. This is retribution. This is Berwick in reverse. Picture the raids as they actually unfold across these weeks. Scottish forces move through the northern English countryside with the same hard efficiency that once characterised English campaigns into Scotland. Barns burned, livestock seized or slaughtered manor houses, stripped of anything valuable and often put to the torch. English chroniclers, writing in the horrified aftermath, describe scenes of genuine devastation across a swath of territory that had grown complacent in its assumption that the war would always be fought somewhere else on someone else's land, in someone else's burning fields. Here is the striking historical fact worth sitting with, and it is one that complicates any purely heroic reading of this chapter. Contemporary English accounts describe the Scottish raids of this period with real horror, detailing violence against clergy, destruction of churches, and civilian casualties on a scale that troubled even chroniclers writing centuries later, with the benefit of some historical distance. This is not a footnote easily brushed aside in service of legend. Wallace's campaign south of the border inflicts genuine brutal suffering on ordinary English people, who had in most cases no more control over Edward's policies than the Scottish farmers whose lives had already been shattered by those same policies. And here is where the emotional wave of this story pulls sharply downward into darker water than the triumphant high of Stirling Bridge. Because the viewer sitting with this history honestly has to hold two things at once: the raw, understandable hunger for retribution burning in men who watched their own families suffer under English occupation, and the uncomfortable reality that retribution, once unleashed, rarely confines itself neatly to the guilty. Historians still argue over how directly Wallace personally ordered or sanctioned the worst of these excesses versus how much reflects the difficulty of controlling a large, angry army operating far from any restraining authority. But the suffering itself, whatever its precise chain of command, was real, and it was inflicted on people whose only crime was living in the wrong kingdom at the wrong moment in history. Here is the quirky, lesser-known detail worth picturing amid this darker material. Several surviving accounts note that Scottish forces during this campaign showed particular restraint by contrast towards certain church properties associated with specific religious orders that had historically maintained good relations with Scotland, while showing none whatsoever toward others perceived as loyal to Edward's cause. It is a small, almost bureaucratic distinction amid general devastation, proof that even amid brutal wartime destruction, some rough calculus of old alliances and grudges continued shaping which targets burned and which curiously did not. There is a moment worth allowing for dry, uneasy humour here, the kind that surfaces almost involuntarily when contemplating the absurd machinery of medieval warfare. English commanders, having spent years treating Scotland as a place where devastation could be inflicted essentially without consequence, now find themselves writing anxious letters south, suddenly deeply concerned about the sanctity of civilian property and the horrors of unrestrained military violence. Principles, it seems, have a curious tendency to sharpen considerably once the burning barns belong to someone's own countrymen. Word of the northern raids reaches Edward still in the process of assembling the massive royal army he intends to lead north personally, and if anything, the reports only harden his resolve. Whatever restraint or caution might have tempered his response to the humiliation of Stirling Bridge evaporates entirely in the face of reports describing English churches burned and English civilians killed by a Scottish army under Wallace's banner. This is no longer in Edward's mind a rebellious province to be pacified with careful diplomacy and strategic patience. This is now unmistakably personal. Wallace and his forces withdraw back across the border, eventually laden with plunder and having accomplished their immediate strategic goals, but they carry something else back with them as well, something far less tangible and far more dangerous. They have guaranteed that when Edward finally marches north, he will do so not merely as a king, reasserting authority over a troublesome territory, but as a monarch, personally furiously determined to destroy the man who dared bring war to English soil. The Guardian of Scotland has won a campaign. He may have also, in doing so, sealed the terms of the reckoning still to come. By early summer of 1398, the horizon to the south begins to darken with something far more ominous than weather and word. Reaching Wallace's scouts describes an English army of a scale rarely seen even in this long and brutal conflict. Edward I himself, riding at its head, having gathered forces from across his kingdom and beyond, determined to erase the humiliation of Stirling Bridge with overwhelming decisive force. Picture the scale of what is approaching, because it matters enormously to everything that follows. This is not the modest garrison force that Wallace's guerrilla tactics proved so devastatingly effective against in years past. This is a royal host heavy with mounted knights, in full armour, supported by Welsh and Gascon longbowmen, whose weapons will prove in the coming battle to be the single deciding factor nobody in the Scottish camp has adequately prepared for. And here is what you have to understand. Edward has learned from Stirling Bridge. He is not the same commander who once dismissed a safer river crossing out of impatience and arrogance. He arrives this time with careful planning, immense resources, and a personal fury that makes him far less likely to repeat his predecessor's mistakes. Wallace, now commanding as guardian rather than as an independent raider, free to strike and vanish at will, faces an impossible strategic bind. The scorched earth tactics that served him so well in the past, denying the enemy supplies, forcing them to overextend into hostile territory, require time and space to work properly. But governing a nation and commanding a coalition of nobles carries its own political pressures, and there is mounting sentiment among some of the nobility that the Guardian ought to meet Edward's army directly rather than continuing to retreat and burn the countryside behind him. Historians still argue over how much this political pressure genuinely shaped Wallace's decisions in the weeks leading up to the coming confrontation versus how much the eventual battle was simply forced upon him by Edward's relentless pursuit through the Lothians. Here is the striking historical fact worth sitting with. As Edward's massive army pushes deeper into Scotland, supply problems begin plaguing his own forces almost immediately. A direct consequence of Wallace's earlier scorched earth strategy, having denied them easy resupply from the surrounding countryside. For a tense stretch of weeks, it appears entirely possible that Edward's invasion might simply collapse under its own logistical weight, forcing a humiliating withdrawal without a single major battle fought. Reports describe growing unrest within the English ranks, soldiers going hungry, morale fraying badly enough that Edward reportedly considers turning back toward Edinburgh to regroup and resupply before the campaign is fully lost. And then, in a turn that feels almost cruelly ironic, given everything that came before, Wallace's own position is undermined not by English strength but by Scottish betrayal. Word reaches Edward's camp, delivered according to several accounts by Scottish nobles disillusioned with or resentful of Wallace's authority, revealing the precise location of the Scottish army camped near the town of Falkirk at the exact moment when Edward, starving, demoralized. The force was on the verge of retreating without ever finding them. Here is the quirky, deeply unsettling detail worth picturing clearly. Some chronicles specifically name the Earls of Dunbar and Angus as the sources of this intelligence. Scottish noblemen who, for reasons of personal rivalry, resentment of Wallace's low birth, or simple political calculation about which side was likely to ultimately prevail, chose in this critical moment to hand their own countryman's position directly to the enemy. Sit with that betrayal for a moment because it deserves real weight rather than a passing mention. Wallace has spent years building a movement out of farmers and landless younger sons who had every practical reason to stay quietly on their land and every practical reason to fear the consequences of joining a rebellion against the most powerful king in the region. Those men risked everything. And now, at the critical hour, it is not a farmer or a common soldier who betrays the cause, but noblemen, men whose class had already proven on the ragman roll years earlier precisely how readily their loyalty could bend under pressure or ambition. There is a bitter note of dry humour worth allowing here, the kind that comes only after genuine anger has had a moment to settle. One almost has to admire the consistency of it. The same Scottish nobility that signed away their independence at the first serious threat that granted Wallace his title, only once he had already proven himself indispensable, now proves willing to hand a starving, retreating English army exactly the information it needs to avoid quietly going home in defeat. With his position revealed, and Edward's army now marching directly toward him rather than retreating, Wallace loses the one advantage that had defined his entire military career up to this point: the ability to choose his ground and his timing on his own terms. He scrambles to prepare a defensive position near Falkirk, arranging his forces into the same dense schiltron formations that proved so devastating to cavalry at Stirling Bridge. Hoping that disciplined spearmen bristling in tight defensive rings might once again neutralize the English numerical advantage the way they did on that marshy field 2 years before. But Falkirk is not Stirling. There is no narrow bridge here to create a fatal bottleneck, no marshy ground to trap cavalry and neutralize the enemy's greatest strength. This time Edward's forces have open ground to maneuver, seasoned commanders determined not to repeat past mistakes, and something Wallace's earlier victories never had to reckon with. In equal measure, thousands of longbowmen whose arrows are about to demonstrate in devastating fashion exactly how vulnerable even the most disciplined spear formation becomes when it cannot move and cannot escape a storm of iron-tipped death raining down from beyond the reach of any spear. The morning of the battle breaks grey and tense over the fields near Falkirk, and Wallace, looking out across the open ground, where his men have arranged themselves into their tight defensive rings, understands with grim clarity that the battle will be fought on terms almost entirely dictated by the enemy. Picture the schiltrons as they stand ready, dense circular formations of spearmen, their long spears angled outward in overlapping rows, creating something that resembles from a distance a series of enormous iron-bristled hedgehogs scattered across the field. This formation served Wallace brilliantly at Stirling Bridge, where cramped, marshy terrain denied English cavalry any room to build momentum. Here at Falkirk, the ground stretches open and firm in every direction, and that difference alone is about to prove catastrophic. And here is what you have to understand. A schiltron is a formation built for defense against cavalry, nearly impenetrable to a mounted charge when it holds its shape. But it is also by its very nature static. The men inside cannot easily move, cannot easily adapt, cannot easily do anything except stand, hold their spears, and endure whatever the enemy chooses to throw at them. Edward, watching the Scottish formations from across the field, makes a decision that reveals exactly how much he has learned since Stirling Bridge. Rather than sending his cavalry directly into the teeth of those spear walls, he holds them back, and instead orders forward his Welsh and Gascon archers, positioning them to rain arrows down upon the packed, immobile schiltrons from a distance. The Scottish spearmen simply cannot close. Here is the striking historical fact worth sitting with, and it is the single detail that determines nearly everything about how this battle unfolds. The longbow, still relatively unfamiliar as a battlefield weapon of this devastating scale, to many Scottish commanders proves capable of punching through the light armour most common soldiers wear with terrifying efficiency and against a tightly packed formation that cannot easily disperse or take cover. The arrows fall not as isolated threats but as a sustained, merciless storm. Men in the outer rows of the schiltrons begin falling in numbers that no amount of discipline or courage can meaningfully offset. This is not a battle of individual heroism deciding the outcome. It is a battle of range and technology, overwhelming formation and courage. One of the earliest clear demonstrations in British military history of exactly how much the longbow is about to reshape warfare for the coming century. Picture the scene from inside one of those schiltrons as the arrows begin falling. Men who stood firm against cavalry charges, who trusted their spears and their formation and the discipline that held them together, now find themselves facing an enemy they cannot reach, cannot fight back against, cannot do anything except endure. The wounded fall inside the tight formation with nowhere to be carried to safety. Gaps begin opening in the outer ranks as men die where they stand, and every gap in a schiltron is a vulnerability that cavalry, still waiting patiently at the field's edge, will exploit the moment it appears. And here is where the bitter turn arrives, the one that has haunted this battle's memory for centuries. As the arrow storm tears the Scottish formations apart, a substantial portion of the mounted Scottish nobility present at the battlemen, whose cavalry support was meant to help protect the schiltrons and exploit any English weakness instead, withdraw from the field, some accounts describing the retreat as beginning astonishingly early, before the battle's outcome had even been fully decided. Historians still argue fiercely over the exact reasons behind this withdrawal. Some suggest genuine tactical panic in the face of overwhelming English numbers. Others point to the same underlying class tensions and resentments that plagued Wallace's brief tenure as Guardian from the beginning, suggesting some nobles were simply unwilling to risk their own lives and resources defending a commander of relatively humble birth once the battle turned difficult. Whatever the precise motivation, the effect on the field is devastating and immediate. With Scottish cavalry gone and the schiltrons pinned in place, unable to maneuver away from the arrow storm without breaking their essential defensive formation, Edward's own cavalry finally charges forward into the gaps the longbowmen have already torn open. What follows is less a battle than a slaughter, the once disciplined spear formations collapsing under combined arrow and cavalry pressure, men scattering across the open field with nowhere to run and no formation left to protect them. There is a small, grim note worth allowing here, amid the horror less humour than a kind of exhausted historical irony. The very discipline and courage that made the Schiltron so devastatingly effective at Stirling Bridge becomes on open ground against archers, a kind of trap of its own making. Sometimes the thing that saves you once is precisely the thing that destroys you the second time, when the terrain and the enemy have both learned their lesson. Wallace survives the battle, though the cost is staggering. Thousands of Scottish soldiers, men who had followed him from burned farms and desperate villages, lie dead across the fields near Falkirk. And here is the quiet, devastating truth Wallace must now sit with, as he leads the shattered remnants of his army away from the field. The same nobility that granted him the title of Guardian, out of necessity, now watches his authority collapse in the aftermath of this defeat, their earlier withdrawal from the field serving as an unmistakable signal that their support was always conditional, always fragile, and now with Falkirk lost, almost certainly finished entirely. In the weeks following Falkirk, Wallace does something that surprises many who expected him to cling desperately to the authority he had fought so hard to earn. He resigns as Guardian of Scotland, stepping away from the formal leadership of cause he has given nearly everything to defend. Picture the moment of that resignation, stripped of any grand ceremony the title might once have deserved. There is no great hall filled with cheering supporters here, no dignified handover of power surrounded by grateful nobles. Instead, there is simply the quiet, practical recognition that his position has become untenable. And here is what you have to understand. Wallace's authority as Guardian was never rooted in noble birth or hereditary right. It rested entirely on his ability to deliver victories no one else could manage. And Falkirk has just demonstrated in the most brutal terms possible that even the man who broke an English army at Stirling Bridge can be broken in turn when the terrain, the technology, and his own supposed allies all turn against him at once. The nobles who fled the field at Falkirk do not step forward now to defend the man whose leadership they abandoned in the battle's critical moments. If anything, the defeat provides useful cover for those who had never fully accepted a farmer's son-wielding authority, a nobleman traditionally claimed as birthright. Command of Scotland's ongoing resistance passes instead to a group of more traditionally credentialed leaders, men whose family names carry the kind of weight that Wallace's battlefield accomplishments, however extraordinary, could never fully substitute for in the eyes of Scotland's persistent class hierarchy. Here is the striking historical fact worth sitting with, and it reveals something important about how quickly fortune can turn, even for a man once celebrated as a national hero. Within roughly a year of standing at the height of his power, formally knighted and governing a nation, Wallace effectively vanishes from the official political life of Scotland's resistance movement entirely. Surviving records from this period grow sparse and uncertain, forcing historians to piece together his movements largely through fragments, rumours, and occasional sightings recorded by others, rather than any clear, continuous narrative of his own choosing. Picture Wallace, now stripped of formal title, moving through a Scotland that both reveres him as a legend and in its official corridors of power has quietly moved past him. Common people in villages still whisper his name with something close to awe, still remember Stirling Bridge as proof that English occupation could be broken by ordinary courage. But the nobles now shaping Scotland's official resistance strategy view him increasingly as a complication rather than an asset. A man whose fame occasionally overshadows their own authority, whose continued presence risks provoking Edward's particular fury in ways that could jeopardize more cautious diplomatic approaches to eventually negotiating some resolution to the ongoing war. And here is the quirky, poignant detail that rarely makes it into the more triumphant tellings of this story. Several accounts from this period describe Wallace continuing to lead small-scale guerrilla operations even after resigning his formal title, essentially returning to the exact kind of warfare that first made his reputation years earlier, before Stirling Bridge ever happened, striking English. Patrols harassing supply lines, refusing to simply disappear even as official Scotland moved on without him. It is almost as though, having briefly worn the mantle of statesman and administrator, he finds a strange relief in returning to the simpler, more familiar work of the outlaw and raider he once was, before politics and titles ever entered the mace. Picture There is a small note of dry, melancholy humour worth allowing here. Wallace spends months as guardian writing careful diplomatic letters to German merchants about wool exports, and now freed of that particular burden seemingly returns with something close to relief to the comparatively straightforward business of ambushing English patrols in the forest. Some men, it turns out, are simply better suited to the sword than to the correspondence desk, however capably they once managed both. But this period of quiet, unofficial resistance cannot last indefinitely, and Wallace himself seems to understand this. Edward, having crushed the Scottish resistance at Falkirk, has not forgotten the man who once humiliated him at Stirling Bridge, and later led raids deep into English territory. Wallace's continued freedom, his refusal to simply surrender or fade quietly into obscurity, represents an ongoing insult to English authority that Edward is determined eventually to resolve permanently. Word begins reaching Wallace through channels. Historians still debate the precise nature of that. Continuing to fight from within Scotland alone may no longer be sufficient. The formal resistance movement, now led by more traditionally credentialed nobles, is pursuing diplomatic avenues seeking support from foreign powers who might pressure Edward through political and religious channels rather than continued battlefield confrontation. And Wallace, restless, uncertain of his place in this new, more cautious phase of the struggle, begins to consider a path that will take him farther from Scotland than he has ever travelled before, across the sea into the courts of France and, ultimately, toward Rome itself, seeking allies, willing to plead Scotland's cause where swords and schiltrons can no longer reach. The ship that carries Wallace across the water toward France rocks steadily beneath a grey sky. And here is a detail worth sitting with immediately. The man who built his entire reputation on knowing every glen, every forest, every hidden path across the Scottish countryside now finds himself utterly outside familiar territory, dependent on foreign courts and foreign patience rather than his own instincts and his own sword. Picture the strangeness of this transition for a moment. Wallace, the outlaw who once vanished into Highland mist after striking English patrols, now navigates the elaborate, unfamiliar etiquette of continental courts, where influence is won through careful diplomacy, patient negotiation, and the slow cultivation of alliances, rather than sudden, decisive victories on a battlefield. And here is what you have to understand. This is not a role Wallace was ever trained for, not a skill he built his legend upon, and the records that survive from this period suggest a man working hard with mixed success to master an entirely different kind of warfare than the one that made him famous. The exact chronology and details of Wallace's continental travels remain frustratingly uncertain, even to careful historians pieced together from scattered references in French and papal records rather than any clear, continuous account. What does seem reasonably well established is that Wallace sought support from Philip IV of France, hoping the French king's own tensions with Edward might translate into meaningful backing for Scotland's cause. Here is the striking historical fact worth sitting with. Surviving correspondence suggests Philip did provide Wallace with letters of introduction intended to help secure an audience with the Pope in Rome, a genuinely significant gesture that placed Scotland's struggle, at least briefly, on the radar of the two most powerful institutions in medieval Christendom, the French crown, and the papacy itself. Picture Wallace making his way toward Rome, a journey that would have taken him through unfamiliar landscapes, entirely removed from anything in his previous experience. The different climate, different languages, different customs of societies that knew Scotland, if they knew it at all, only as a distant, troubled territory on the edge of the known world. For a man whose entire identity had been forged in specific, intimate knowledge of Scottish terrain and Scottish grievances, this journey represents a kind of exile even before any formal declaration of outlawry follows him. And here is the quirky, lesser-known detail that adds real texture to this otherwise sparse chapter of his story. Some historians have suggested, based on fragmentary evidence, that Wallace's diplomatic mission included attempts to secure support not just through direct royal channels, but through broader networks of clergy and scholars sympathetic to Scotland's cause, individuals who might argue Scotland's case through the more formal, legalistic language of canon law and papal politics, rather than the language of grievance and battlefield heroism that had made Wallace's reputation at home. It is a strange picture to hold in mind, the man once described in English chronicles with something close to horrified awe for his battlefield ferocity, now sitting in quiet rooms with churchmen discussing the fine points of legal argument and diplomatic precedent. There is a small note of dry humour worth allowing here, one that surfaces almost involuntarily when picturing this scene. Clearly one imagines Wallace, a man who once personally cut down an English sheriff in his own home under cover of darkness, now patiently waiting in antechambers for scheduled audiences with clerks and cardinals, forced to master an entirely new vocabulary of patience that battlefield command never once required of him. But diplomacy, however patiently pursued, faces a fundamental obstacle that no amount of careful argument can fully overcome. Edward I is not merely a regional adversary whose grievances can be smoothed over through clever negotiation. He is one of the most powerful monarchs in Europe, with extensive diplomatic and financial leverage of his own and foreign courts, weighing whether to meaningfully support Scotland's cause must constantly balance genuine sympathy against the very real risk of provoking English hostility in return. Support for Wallace's mission, however, sincere in the moment, tends to remain frustratingly abstract expressions of sympathy, letters of introduction, vague diplomatic gestures, rather than the kind of concrete military or financial backing that might actually shift the balance of the ongoing war. Back home, meanwhile, back in Scotland, the war continues without him, shaped now by the more cautious, traditionally credentialed nobles who assumed leadership after Falkirk. Edward continues tightening his grip on Scottish territory, castle by castle, region by region, and Wallace, watching from a distance, measured now in hundreds of miles, rather than familiar forest paths, faces a growing, uncomfortable realization. Whatever diplomatic progress might slowly accumulate in foreign courts, it offers no immediate relief to the ordinary Scots still living under increasingly harsh occupation at home. And somewhere in the back of his mind, even as he pursues this new, unfamiliar kind of warfare, the old instinct that first drove him from a burned farmstead toward rebellion begins pulling him back toward home, back toward Scotland, back toward danger, back toward a price on his head that grows larger. And more determined with every year he continues against all odds to remain alive and free. Wallace returns to Scotland eventually, though the historical record grows even thinner and more uncertain regarding exactly when and how, and the Scotland he returns to is one where his own survival has become quite literally a matter with a specific price attached to it. Picture the nature of that price for a moment, because it reveals exactly how seriously Edward now takes the threat this one man continues to represent, even years after Falkirk supposedly broke the back of organised Scottish resistance. Edward's determination to capture or kill Wallace has hardened into something approaching obsession, and English officials operating throughout occupied Scotland receive clear standing instructions that Wallace's capture takes priority over nearly every other consideration. And here is what you have to understand. This is not the treatment typically afforded to an ordinary outlaw, however troublesome. This is the treatment reserved for a man Edward has come to view as a uniquely personal and symbolic threat. Someone whose continued freedom represents an open wound to English authority that no amount of territorial conquest elsewhere in Scotland can fully heal. Wallace moving now through a landscape far more dangerous to him than the countryside he once knew as a young rebel. Building his first following adopts the life of a genuine fugitive, rarely staying in any single location long enough to be reliably found, relying on a shrinking network of loyal supporters willing to risk everything by sheltering him. Here is the striking historical fact worth sitting with, and it carries real weight. By this stage of the conflict, Edward's government has begun offering explicit financial rewards, and in some accounts promises of land or advancement to anyone who might provide information leading to Wallace's capture. This transforms the nature of the danger Wallace faces entirely. It is no longer simply a matter of avoiding English patrols and garrisons. It is a matter of surviving in a landscape where former allies, financially desperate neighbours, or simply frightened acquaintances might, under the right pressure or temptation, become informants. Picture the particular corrosive kind of fear this creates, different from the straightforward danger of battlefield combat Wallace has faced throughout his life. A soldier on a battlefield knows broadly where danger comes from. A fugitive relying on a network of sympathetic households faces a far more intimate and unsettling threat. The quiet knock at the door that might be a friend bringing food, or might be someone who has decided after years of hardship under occupation that the reward for betrayal finally outweighs whatever loyalty or admiration they once felt. And here is the quirky, deeply unsettling detail that captures something essential about this period of Wallace's life, one that historians still return to for its strange, almost novelistic texture. Several accounts describe Wallace deliberately varying his patterns constantly during this period, never sleeping in the same location on consecutive nights, avoiding predictable routes, even when traveling relatively short distances, treating every seemingly friendly encounter with a wariness that must have been genuinely exhausting to sustain over months and years. The man who once moved through Scotland's forests with the confident freedom of someone who knew every hidden path now moves through that same landscape as someone who trusts almost nothing and almost no one completely. There is a small, bitter note of dry humour worth allowing here, the kind that emerges only from genuine exhaustion rather than any lightness of spirit one imagines. Wallace, a man once celebrated in grand halls as Guardian of Scotland, reduced now to calculating which barn might be safe to sleep in on any given night, his considerable talents for strategy and leadership redirected almost entirely toward the grim, unglamorous business of simply staying alive one more day. Meanwhile, the broader war grinds on without him occupying its centre stage any longer. Edward continues his methodical conquest of Scottish castles and territory, meeting periodic resistance from the more traditionally led Scottish forces, but steadily, relentlessly expanding his control. Some Scottish nobles who once resisted have by now made their peace with English authority, calculating that continued resistance offers diminishing returns against a king who has demonstrated repeatedly both the resources and the ruthlessness to eventually crush any organised opposition. Wallace refusing to join this growing accommodation becomes something increasingly unusual in occupied Scotland, one of the very few prominent figures from the early years of resistance, who has never submitted, never negotiated terms, never accepted any version of peace that leaves English authority intact over his homeland. This stubborn, uncompromising refusal is precisely what makes him so valuable a target and so enduring a symbol simultaneously. To ordinary Scots still chafing under occupation, Wallace's continued freedom, however precarious, represents proof that submission is not the only available response to English power. To Edward, that same continued freedom represents an infuriating loose thread in what should otherwise be a nearly completed conquest. And somewhere in the tangled, dangerous network of loyalties, resentments, financial desperation, and old grievances that now surrounds Wallace's fugitive existence, a specific betrayal is beginning to take shape, one that will not come from a battlefield or a foreign court, but from someone far closer to him, someone whose name will become in Scottish memory nearly as infamous as Wallace's own name becomes heroic. While Wallace moves through the shadows as a hunted man, the Scotland around him settles slowly and painfully into something that looks increasingly like permanent occupation. And the contrast between the two, the legend still whispered by firesides, and the grim practical reality of a subdued nation, grows sharper with every passing season. Picture the administrative machinery Edward now installs across Scotland, because it reveals something important about how thoroughly conquest can reshape a nation once resistance falters on the battlefield. English officials take up positions in castles and courts throughout the country. Scottish law finds itself increasingly subordinated to English precedent and English priorities, and the traditional structures of Scottish governance that once, however, imperfectly represented some measure of national self-determination now function largely as instruments of occupation rather than genuine self-rule. And here is what you have to understand. This is precisely the outcome the entire war has been fought to prevent, and by this stage it appears to be settling into place with a grim bureaucratic permanence that no single dramatic battlefield victory can any longer reverse. Here is the striking historical fact worth sitting with. By the early 1300s, Edward has achieved a level of practical control over Scotland more thorough and more durable than anything accomplished at any earlier point in the conflict, including the years immediately following Berwick. Most major Scottish castles now fly English banners. Most prominent Scottish nobles who once resisted have in one form or another made their peace with English authority, whether through genuine conviction, exhaustion, or simple calculation about which side now holds the advantage. The organised, noble-led resistance that took over after Wallace's resignation as Guardian has itself largely folded into negotiated submission, unable to match the sustained pressure of Edward's methodical conquest. Picture ordinary life continuing beneath this heavy administrative weight, because the texture of occupation reveals itself less in dramatic battles than in the accumulated small indignities of daily existence. Scottish merchants navigate English customs regulations designed to extract maximum value for the English crown. Scottish farmers pay taxes to officials who answer not to any Scottish authority but directly to Edward's government. Scottish law courts increasingly find English legal precedent imposed over traditional Scottish practice. It is in its way a quieter and more insidious kind of conquest than Berwick's dramatic massacre. Not the sudden shock of slaughter, but the slow, grinding normalization of foreign rule as simply the way things now are. And yet, even amid this settling occupation, something curious persists that troubles English administrators far more than any single remaining band of resistance fighters could. Here is the quirky telling detail worth picturing clearly. English officials stationed in Scotland during this period report with evident frustration that Wallace's name continues circulating through the countryside, not merely as the memory of a defeated rebel, but as something closer to active legend stories told in taverns and farmhouses, describing exploits that grow more elaborate with each, retelling tales that blend genuine history with increasingly mythical embellishment, transforming a specific historical man into something closer to a folk hero whose exact deeds matter less than the defiant spirit he has come to represent. Historians still debate how much of this legend building happened during Wallace's own lifetime versus developing more fully after his death, but contemporary English sources suggest the mythologizing process was already well underway, even while the real man remained alive, hunted, increasingly isolated. There is a small note of dry, uneasy humour worth allowing here. Edward's government has by this point conquered nearly the entirety of Scotland through overwhelming military and administrative force, and yet finds itself apparently unable to conquer the far more stubborn territory of Scottish storytelling, where a single fugitive with a shrinking network of allies continues through nothing more than rumour and reputation to represent a defiance that entire English garrisons have failed to fully extinguish. This growing gap between practical political reality and enduring popular legend creates a peculiar, dangerous dynamic for Wallace himself. The more his name grows as a symbol of resistance among ordinary Scots, the more valuable his actual capture becomes to Edward, not merely as the elimination of a genuine military threat, which by this point he arguably no longer represents, in any organised sense, but as a devastating symbolic blow against the very idea that Scottish defiance remains alive and worth sustaining. Capturing or killing the actual man becomes in a strange way increasingly necessary, precisely because the legend surrounding him has grown so far beyond what the actual fugitive, exhausted and increasingly isolated, is still capable of accomplishing on any battlefield. And so the hunt intensifies rather than relaxes, even as Wallace's practical military relevance diminishes, with each passing year of occupation settling more firmly into place. English patrols receive renewed urgency in their searches. Rewards for information grow more generous. And somewhere within Wallace's shrinking, increasingly precarious circle of remaining allies and supporters, the pressures of fear, financial desperation, and the sheer exhausting difficulty of protecting a fugitive whose survival now matters more symbolically than practically begin creating exactly the kind of conditions under which betrayal sooner or later becomes almost inevitable. The night near Rob Royston is quiet, in the particular way that Wallace has learned over years of fugitive existence to distrust more than any obvious sign of danger. Too still, too undisturbed, the kind of silence that experienced hunted men come to recognize as potentially the calm immediately preceding disaster. Picture the scene as it likely unfolded, pieced together from the fragmentary accounts that survive this pivotal night. Wallace, by this point relying on an increasingly narrow circle of remaining allies for shelter and safety, has taken refuge in a house near Rob Royston, a location chosen presumably for exactly the discretion and apparent safety that made it seem, at least until this night, a reasonably secure hiding place. And here is what you have to understand after years of successfully evading capture through careful vigilance and constant movement. Even the most disciplined fugitive eventually faces a fundamental, unavoidable vulnerability: sleep. A body, however trained to wariness, cannot remain permanently alert, and it is precisely in these moments of necessary rest that betrayal, when it comes, tends to strike with the most devastating effectiveness. The man history remembers as responsible for this final decisive betrayal is Sir John de Menteith, a Scottish knight whose name becomes in the centuries following this night almost as permanently attached to infamy as Wallace's own name becomes attached to heroism. Here is the striking historical fact worth sitting with, and it carries a particular bitterness given everything that has come before. Menteith is not some anonymous informant motivated by simple financial desperation, but a man of standing, a Scottish knight who had by this point in the war made his own accommodation with English authority, serving in a position of some responsibility within the English administration of Scotland. It is once again not the common people who deliver the final blow, but a member of the same class that signed the rigmarole that fled the field at Falkirk, that has consistently throughout this entire conflict proven far more willing to bend toward whichever side offers the greater practical advantage. Picture the ambush itself as it unfolds in the darkness. Menteith, according to the accounts that have survived, arranges for Wallace's location to be surrounded, the house near Rob Royston suddenly finding itself encircled by men acting on English authority, the careful discretion that had protected Wallace through so many previous close calls rendered useless in a single coordinated strike. Historians still argue over the precise details, whether Wallace is captured while sleeping, whether there is any final struggle, whether Menteith is present personally, or simply provides the crucial intelligence that allows others to execute the capture. What remains consistently clear across the surviving accounts is the essential fact that matters most. After years of evading every previous attempt, Wallace is finally decisively captured, brought down, not by superior English military force in open battle, but by the quiet, calculated betrayal of a fellow Scot. Here is the quirky, grimly ironic detail that has fascinated storytellers for centuries since. Some later Scottish folklore claims that Menteith received his reward for the betrayal not in straightforward coin, but in a portion of land, and that the specific parcel involved became known locally in bitter popular memory by a name, essentially translating to traitor's land or similar variations depending on the source, a permanent, geographically anchored monument to shame that supposedly lingered in local memory for generations afterward. Historians treat this particular detail with appropriate skepticism as the kind of embellishment that popular memory loves to attach to villains of this magnitude, but its persistence across multiple tellings speaks to just how deeply Menteith's name became synonymous with betrayal in the Scottish popular imagination. There is a small, exceptionally bitter note of dry humour worth allowing here, though it comes wrapped in genuine anger rather than any real lightness. One struggles to imagine a more perfectly symmetrical betrayal than a knight secure in his own accommodation with occupying power delivering into English hands the one man who spent his entire adult life refusing exactly the kind of compromise Menteith himself had long since made. Wallace now bound and in English custody for what may be, depending on which accounts one credits, the first time in his entire life, as a fighting man faces an entirely new and different kind of danger than anything the battlefield ever presented. This is not a fight he can win through tactical brilliance or raw physical courage. This is a fight, if it can even be called that will be waged instead through the machinery of English law and English ceremony, deliberately designed not merely to execute him, but to make an example of him so thorough and so public that it might finally permanently extinguish whatever remains of the resistance his name still inspires. And so begins the final grim chapter of Wallace's story. Not a battle, not a raid, not a desperate flight through familiar forests, but a long, humiliating journey south in chains, toward a city he has never seen to face, a trial whose Outcome has almost certainly already been decided long before he ever arrives. The road south stretches long and merciless, and Wallace, for the first time in a life defined by movement through familiar Scottish terrain, chosen entirely on his own terms, now travels as cargo rather than as a man in command of his own direction, bound, guarded and paraded deliberately through towns and villages along a route clearly designed to maximize public spectacle rather than simple efficiency. Picture the journey as it likely unfolded across those difficult weeks. English authorities, having finally captured the man who eluded them for years, show no inclination whatsoever toward quiet or discreet transport. Quite the opposite. And here is what you have to understand. Edward's government understands the propaganda value of this capture as clearly as it understands the practical military value of removing Wallace from the field entirely. A prisoner transported quietly through back roads accomplishes only the narrow goal of getting him to trial. A prisoner paraded publicly through town after town, displayed to crowds who have heard his name whispered as legend for years, accomplishes something far more valuable to English authority. It demonstrates unmistakably and visibly that even the most famous and elusive symbol of Scottish resistance can be reduced to a bound and guarded captive, dependent entirely on his captor's mercy for his continued survival. Here is the striking historical fact worth sitting with. Contemporary accounts describe the journey south as deliberately structured to pass through significant towns along the route, allowing crowds to gather and witness the sight of Wallace in captivity, a form of psychological theatre that medieval authorities across Europe understood and employed regularly when dealing with prisoners whose capture carried significant symbolic weight beyond their immediate practical threat. This is not incidental to the journey. This is, in many respects, the primary point of the journey itself, transforming a simple prisoner transport into a carefully orchestrated demonstration of English power, extending its reach even over Scotland's most legendary resistance. Picture the crowds gathering along the route as word spreads ahead of the procession's arrival in each town. Some come out of genuine curiosity, eager simply to glimpse a figure whose exploits have been the subject of years of storytelling. Some English onlookers come with open hostility, viewing Wallace as responsible for raids and violence that touched their own communities during his earlier campaign into northern England. And presumably scattered among these crowds in towns closer to the Scottish border at least, some onlookers watch with a very different, more complicated emotion, entirely recognition of a fellow countryman being displayed in humiliation, unable to offer any visible support without risking their own safety in the process. And here is the quirky, deeply unsettling detail that captures something essential about the deliberate cruelty embedded in this journey's design. Several accounts suggest that Wallace's captors took specific care during the transport to ensure his continued visibility and recognizability throughout the journey, avoiding any covering or concealment that might have spared him the deliberate public humiliation central to the entire exercise. Whether this reflects deliberate policy dictated from the highest levels of Edward's government or simply the accumulated cruelty of individual guards enjoying their temporary power over a famous and hated prisoner, historians still debate, but the effect, whatever its precise origin, remains the same: a journey designed not merely to transport a prisoner, but to systematically strip away town by town, mile by mile, whatever dignity might otherwise have remained available to a man about to face trial and near certain execution. There is a small, exceptionally grim note worth allowing here, less humour than a kind of bitter historical observation. Edward, who spent years and enormous resources attempting to capture this one man through military force, diplomatic pressure and financial reward, now achieves, through public spectacle, exactly the demoralizing effect on Scottish resistance that years of battlefield campaigning never quite managed to fully secure. Sometimes the most effective weapon available to a conqueror is not the sword at all, but simply the deliberate, patient cruelty of public humiliation, carefully staged and widely witnessed. As the procession finally approaches London itself, the crowds grow even larger and the spectacle even more deliberately theatrical, the city's residents, having heard for years of this legendary Scottish rebel, and now finally presented the opportunity to witness him in person, bound and utterly at the mercy of English authority. Wallace, exhausted from the journey and facing a trial whose predetermined outcome he almost certainly understands with clear-eyed realism, is brought finally to Westminster Hall, the very seat of English royal and legal authority chosen, deliberately for the symbolic weight it carries. And there, in a setting designed entirely to project the full, overwhelming majesty of English law and English power, Wallace is about to face a trial that will offer him almost nothing resembling genuine justice, but will offer him in its place one final opportunity to speak words that history will remember long after the specific legal proceedings against him have faded into obscure footnote. Westminster Hall rises around Wallace in cold stone grandeur, its vast timbered ceiling stretching overhead like something built deliberately to remind any prisoner standing at its centre exactly how small an individual life measures against the accumulated weight of English royal power. Picture the scene as it unfolds on this particular day in August of 1305. The hall fills with English judges, nobles, and officials, each arranged with the careful hierarchical precision that medieval ceremony demands every detail of the proceeding, designed to project overwhelming legitimacy and authority. And here is what you have to understand: this trial, for all its formal legal trappings, carries almost none of the genuine uncertainty that the word trial typically implies. The outcome has been determined long before Wallace ever enters the hall. What remains is essentially theatre, a carefully staged demonstration of English justice being applied with visible and deliberate ceremony to the most notorious enemy the English crown has faced in a generation. The charges levelled against Wallace reveal something particularly telling about how English authority chooses to frame this proceeding. He stands accused of treason, a charge that carries with it the presumption of prior loyalty, betrayed the assumption that Wallace, as a subject owing allegiance to Edward, has broken faith with a legitimate sovereign. Here is the striking historical fact worth sitting with because it captures the central legal absurdity at the very heart of this trial. Wallace has never at any point in his life sworn any oath of loyalty to Edward. He signed no ragman roll. He took no formal position within any English administration. By any reasonable legal standard, a man who never pledged allegiance cannot in any coherent sense be guilty of betraying an allegiance he never gave. And yet the charge proceeds regardless because English legal theory of this era holds with a convenience that serves the Crown's interests perfectly, that all residents of Scotland owe Edward loyalty as their rightful overlord, whether they ever formally acknowledge that relationship or not. Picture Wallace standing before this assembly, exhausted from his long journey south, facing judges who have already determined his fate, and yet refusing even now to simply accept the legal framework being imposed upon him without challenge. And here is what the surviving accounts, however filtered through generations of retelling, consistently preserve as the defining moment of this entire proceeding. When given opportunity to respond to the charges against him, Wallace does not plead for mercy, does not attempt the kind of desperate legal maneuvering that might, in theory, have offered some faint hope of a more lenient outcome. Instead, he challenges the fundamental premise of the charge itself. He cannot, he insists, be guilty of treason against a king to whom he never swore loyalty. Whatever violence he committed against English forces and English officials throughout the long years of conflict he committed as an enemy combatant, defending his own nation against foreign invasion, not as a subject rebelling against his own rightful sovereign. It is, when examined honestly, a remarkably coherent and legally sophisticated argument for a man whose formal education, whatever its exact extent, never prepared him specifically for courtroom advocacy of this kind. Historians still debate exactly how much of the specific phrasing attributed to Wallace in later retellings reflects genuine contemporary record versus later embellishment designed to enhance his heroic defiance, but the core substance of the argument that he owed Edward no loyalty to betray in the first place appears consistently across multiple independent accounts close to the actual event. Here is the quirky, striking detail that has captured imaginations for centuries since, regardless of exactly how precisely it reflects the literal historical record. Several accounts describe Wallace in a moment of dark, defiant wit, amid an otherwise grim proceeding, pointing out the particular irony of being tried under a legal framework that simultaneously claims him as a subject owing loyalty, while also throughout years of conflict treating him as a foreign enemy to be captured and eliminated by military force rather than a domestic criminal to be arrested through ordinary legal process. One cannot, he suggests, have it both ways. Treat a man as an enemy nation's soldier when convenient for military purposes, and then as a treasonous subject when convenient for legal condemnation. There is a small, bitter note of dry humour worth allowing here, the kind of gallows wit that surfaces only in the most genuinely desperate circumstances. Wallace standing in the most powerful legal chamber in England, facing judges who have already decided his fate, regardless of any argument he might present, nonetheless manages to identify and articulate a genuine logical contradiction at the very heart of the proceeding against him. A small intellectual victory that changes nothing about his actual fate, but ensures that his final, recorded words carry real substance rather than simple pleading. The judges, unsurprisingly, remain entirely unmoved by the legal sophistication of Wallace's defense. The verdict, as expected, comes down as guilty, and the sentence pronounced against him is designed not merely to end his life, but to do so through a method of execution so deliberately brutal and public that it will serve in its own horrifying way as one final piece of theatre, the ultimate demonstration of what English authority is prepared to do to anyone who continues to resist its claims over Scotland, however coherent and however principled that resistance might have been. The morning of Wallace's execution arrives, with the city of London already stirring long before dawn, crowds beginning to gather in numbers that suggest this will be no ordinary public punishment, but rather one of the defining spectacles of the era. Grandchildren, decades after the details have otherwise faded from memory, picture the route itself, because English authorities have designed every element of this final procession with the same deliberate theatrical intent that characterized Wallace's long journey south from Scotland. He is dragged, according to the accounts that survive, tied behind a horse, rather than permitted to walk or ride with any remaining dignity. The specific method chosen, precisely because it strips away every last vestige of the warriors, bearing that made him legendary in the first place. And here is what you have to understand: this final humiliation is not incidental cruelty, it is the entire point. Edward's government intends this execution to communicate in the clearest possible terms to anyone still harbouring sympathy for Scottish resistance exactly what fate awaits those who continue defying English authority, regardless of how skilled or celebrated they might have once been on the battlefield. The crowds lining the route present a genuinely mixed and complicated picture, one worth sitting with honestly, rather than flattening into simple narrative convenience. Here is the striking historical fact worth acknowledging. Contemporary accounts suggest reactions among the assembled Londoners varied considerably, some expressing the kind of open hostility one might expect toward a man associated in English popular memory with brutal raids into northern England, others reportedly showing something closer to grim curiosity or even quiet, uneasy sympathy for a prisoner facing a punishment of such calculated severity. Public executions of this era served multiple, sometimes contradictory purposes simultaneously. They satisfied a genuine hunger for spectacle and justice among crowds who had suffered real harm from the ongoing conflict, while also, for at least some onlookers, provoking the kind of uneasy reflection that excessive cruelty toward even a hated enemy sometimes inspires in witnesses forced to watch it unfold at close range. The specific method of execution ordered against Wallace reflects the absolute maximum severity available under English law for the crime of treason, a punishment deliberately designed across multiple stages to prolong both the physical suffering and the public spectacle far beyond what a simple, swift execution would accomplish. Without dwelling on graphic particulars that serve no purpose beyond gratuitous horror, it is enough to understand that the sentence combined several distinct and escalating forms of punishment, each stage witnessed publicly by the assembled crowds, the entire sequence designed explicitly to demonstrate the absolute completeness of English authority over a body that had for years proven so frustratingly difficult to capture and control in life. Here is the quirky, grimly telling detail that reveals something important about how thoroughly English authorities intended this execution to function as ongoing propaganda rather than a single contained event. Following the execution, Wallace's remains were reportedly divided and displayed publicly in several different locations across England and Scotland, including, according to multiple accounts, prominent display at London Bridge and separate displays in cities, including Newcastle, Berwick, Stirling, and Perth. This was not incidental practice but standard procedure for the most severe treason cases of the era, intended to extend the deterrent message of the execution across the widest possible geographic area, ensuring that communities far from London itself would receive direct, unmistakable evidence of what had befallen Scotland's most famous rebel. There is a small, deeply bitter note worth allowing here, less humour than pointed historical irony. Edward's government, in its determination to eliminate every trace of Wallace as a living threat and to broadcast his execution as widely and thoroughly as any medieval technology permitted, inadvertently ensures that his name and memory spread more thoroughly across Scotland than perhaps any deliberate campaign of legend-building on Wallace's own part ever could have accomplished while he still lived. The very mechanism designed to extinguish his symbolic power instead guarantees that no corner of Scotland remains entirely unaware of what happened to him and why. And here, sitting with the full weight of this brutal, calculated ending, the story arrives at perhaps its most difficult and necessary emotional turn. Wallace dies not in the glory of battle, not with a sword in hand facing an honourable enemy, but through a punishment specifically engineered to strip away every trace of the dignity and heroism his life had otherwise earned. It would be easy and dishonest to soften this reality into something more palatable. The truth is starker and more difficult to sit with. English authority, having failed for years to defeat Wallace decisively through military means alone, ultimately achieves his death through betrayal and calculated public cruelty rather than honourable combat. But here is what those same authorities fail to fully anticipate, standing amid the satisfaction of their carefully staged spectacle. A legend, once it has taken root deeply enough in the hearts of an occupied people, does not die simply because the man who inspired it does. If anything, the manner of Wallace's death, its brutality, its calculated cruelty, its deliberate humiliation of a figure so many Scots had quietly admired, is about to prove far more dangerous to continued English authority in Scotland than his continued survival as a fugitive ever was. News of Wallace's execution travels back into Scotland with a speed and emotional force that catches even Edward's own officials somewhat by surprise, and the reaction it provokes across the country reveals in stark and immediate terms exactly how badly the calculated cruelty of that public spectacle has misjudged its intended effect. Picture the news arriving in villages and towns across Scotland, carried by travellers and merchants who had witnessed or heard direct accounts of the execution itself. The brutal, deliberate details spreading with the same intensity that once carried word of the Berwick massacre years earlier. And here is what you have to understand. Edward's government designed this execution specifically to demoralise continued Scottish resistance, to demonstrate so thoroughly and publicly the fate awaiting anyone who defied English authority that further rebellion would come to seem in the calculus of ordinary Scots, weighing risk against reward, simply not worth the almost certain cost. Instead, something closer to the opposite effect begins taking hold. Here is the striking historical fact worth sitting with, and it captures something genuinely important about how martyrdom functions across history far more broadly than this single conflict. Rather than extinguishing Scottish resistance, Wallace's brutal, calculated execution transforms him almost immediately from a living fugitive, with genuine, complicated limitations, into something considerably more powerful and considerably harder for any occupying force to combat. A martyr whose memory becomes, if anything, more useful to the cause of Scottish independence in death than his actual physical presence. Hunted and increasingly isolated, had been capable of providing in his final years alive. Historians studying the years immediately following his execution note a marked hardening of Scottish resistance sentiment, a renewed willingness among ordinary Scots and even some previously accommodating nobles to consider that continued English rule might not after all represent the permanent, unchangeable reality it had begun to seem. Picture the psychological shift this represents across the country. Wallace, while alive, remained a complicated and genuinely divisive figure, even within Scotland itself. A man of relatively humble birth, whose authority as guardian had never entirely settled comfortably, with a nobility still instinctively suspicious of leadership from outside their own traditional ranks, a commander whose brutal raids into northern England had inflicted real, sometimes indiscriminate suffering that troubled even some sympathetic to his broader cause. Death, and particularly a death staged with such calculated excessive cruelty, strips away much of that complicating nuance in the collective memory that follows. What remains increasingly is a simplified, powerful symbol, the commoner who dared to lead when the nobility would not. The man who refused every opportunity to submit or compromise, whose defiance persisted right up until an execution, designed specifically to break that defiance publicly and failed. Instead, to break anything except English assumptions about how Scottish resistance actually worked. Here is the quirky, genuinely fascinating detail that historians point to as evidence of exactly how quickly this transformation from man to legend accelerated. Within remarkably short order following his death, references to Wallace begin appearing in various forms of popular storytelling and song throughout Scotland. The historical particulars of his actual life and campaigns already beginning to blur even this early into something closer to folk legend than straightforward historical memory. This process, which continues for centuries afterward, ultimately produces the sprawling, semi-legendary accounts that later poets and chroniclers would draw upon, extensively layering additional embellishment onto a story that required, if anything, remarkably little exaggeration to already qualify as extraordinary. There is a small pointed note of dry historical irony worth allowing here, one that carries real weight despite its grim subject matter. Edward I, a monarch whose considerable political and military talents are rarely disputed by serious historians, manages through this single, catastrophic miscalculation to transform his most troublesome adversary from a hunted, increasingly isolated fugitive into an immortal symbol of resistance that will continue inspiring Scottish defiance for centuries after both men have long since died. Few military or political defeats in history carry quite this particular flavour of self-inflicted, entirely avoidable irony. Meanwhile, the practical material effects of this shifting sentiment take longer to manifest in concrete military terms, but they do eventually arrive. Among the Scottish nobility, watching this transformation unfold, one figure in particular begins moving carefully and patiently toward a position where he might eventually claim leadership of a renewed independence movement, Robert the Bruce, a man whose own relationship with both English authority and Scottish resistance has been throughout this long conflict considerably more complicated and pragmatic than Wallace's uncompromising defiance ever was. And here, at the close of this particular chapter of the larger story, sits a striking, almost poetic historical irony, worth holding carefully in mind as the narrative moves toward its final resolution. It will not be Wallace dead now, years before the decisive battle that finally secures genuine Scottish independence, who leads Scotland to that ultimate victory. It will be Bruce, a man whose path to that same cause wound through considerably more compromise, more calculation, and more shifting allegiance than Wallace's own uncompromising resistance ever permitted. But the momentum Bruce eventually rides toward that final victory, the renewed Scottish willingness to risk everything once more for genuine independence, traces back directly to the martyrdom, created, however unintentionally, by Edward's own calculated cruelty at Wallace's execution. Years pass following Wallace's execution, and the Scotland that eventually rises again to confront English authority does so under leadership considerably different in character and temperament from the man whose death helped reignite the flame of resistance in the first place, though the connection between his sacrifice and what finally follows remains impossible to fully separate. Picture Robert the Bruce's own complicated path toward eventual leadership, because understanding it properly requires acknowledging uncomfortable truths that simpler, more heroic tellings of this larger story often prefer to smooth over. Bruce had, at various points throughout the long conflict, sworn loyalty to Edward, fought at times on the English side against fellow Scots, and generally pursued a considerably more pragmatic, self-interested path than Wallace's uncompromising defiance ever allowed for. And here is what you have to understand. This is not in itself a moral failing unique to Bruce, but rather the ordinary calculus of survival and advancement that most powerful medieval nobles navigated constantly throughout this era, weighing personal and family interest against larger questions of national loyalty in ways that Wallace, lacking equivalent land, title, and family political position to protect, never faced in quite the same complicated form. Bruce eventually claims the Scottish crown for himself in 1306, a controversial and violent path to power that itself involves the killing of a rival claimant, John Comyn, in circumstances that remain debated by historians to this day. But having claimed that Crown, Bruce commits to the cause of Scottish independence with a persistence and eventual success that, whatever the complicated path that brought him to that position, ultimately achieves what Wallace's more uncompromising resistance, for all its heroism, was never quite able to secure on its own. Here is the striking historical fact that brings this long, sprawling story toward its resolution. In June of 1314, Bruce's forces meet a substantial English army under Edward II, son of the Longshanks, who ordered Wallace's execution years earlier at Bannockburn, near Stirling, remarkably close to the same ground where Wallace and Moray achieved their own great victory, nearly 2 decades before. And here, in a battle that draws on many of the same tactical principles that made Stirling Bridge so devastating, disciplined Scottish spearmen exploiting difficult terrain against a larger, more cumbersome English force, Bruce achieves a victory decisive enough to finally definitively secure Scottish independence in a way that no previous battle throughout this entire long conflict, including Wallace's own triumph at Stirling Bridge, had quite managed to accomplish permanently. Picture the strange, poignant symmetry worth sitting with as this story reaches its true conclusion. The tactics that win at Bannockburn, the very ground on which that victory unfolds, the accumulated momentum of Scottish resistance that made this final triumph possible at all. Every element traces back in some meaningful way to the Prosserblinding foundation Wallace built through years of resistance, sacrifice, and, ultimately, martyrdom. He does not live to see this final victory. He does not lead the army that achieves it. And yet the war he refused to abandon, even when every practical calculation might have counseled submission, eventually reaches exactly the resolution he spent his entire adult life fighting toward. Here is the quirky, deeply human detail worth closing on, one that captures something essential about how history actually remembers its heroes, often quite differently from how those heroes might have understood themselves in life. In the centuries following Bannockburn, as Scottish national identity continued developing and consolidating around the memory of this long independence struggle, Wallace's reputation steadily grows to overshadow even Bruce's own considerable, ultimately more successful contribution to the day. Same cause. Bruce, the man who actually secured lasting independence, becomes in popular memory somewhat overshadowed by Wallace, the man who never lived to see that independence secured at all. Historians still find this asymmetry worth examining, suggesting something important about how national mythology tends to favor uncompromising tragic heroism over pragmatic, ultimately successful compromise, however much the latter actually accomplished in concrete historical terms. There is a final gentle note of dry observation worth allowing here, before this long story settles toward its close. Perhaps there is a certain justice, however historically imprecise, in a nation choosing to remember most vividly not the king who won the war, but the outlaw who refused against every reasonable calculation to ever stop fighting it. Bruce achieved the victory. Wallace, in the end, seems to have achieved something. History has decided to value even more highly the stubborn, uncompromising conviction that made that eventual victory possible in the first place. Scotland, following Bannockburn, would still face further conflict and complication in the centuries ahead, its independence never entirely free from ongoing tension with its powerful southern neighbour. But the specific chapter that began with a young boy watching his father die in a muddy Ayrshire farmyard, and that wound through rebellion, brief power, catastrophic defeat, fugitive exile, betrayal, and finally a brutal, calculated execution, designed to extinguish resistance forever, ultimately closes Instead, with independence secured, however imperfectly, and however temporarily measured, against the longer sweep of history still to come. William Wallace remains, centuries later, one of history's most enduring examples of a specific, difficult kind of courage. Not the courage of ultimate victory which he never lived to witness, but the harder, more stubborn courage of refusing to abandon a cause even when every practical calculation suggested surrender would have been the wiser, safer path. He was by any honest accounting a complicated figure, capable of real brutality, alongside genuine heroism, elevated by circumstance and necessity to a position of leadership his birth would never otherwise have permitted, ultimately betrayed, not by the common people who followed him, but repeatedly by the noble class that alternately used and abandoned him according to its own shifting calculations of advantage. And perhaps that complexity, rather than any simplified heroic legend, is the version of this story most worth carrying forward into memory. Now let the mist begin to settle, slow and quiet, over the hills of Ayrshire once more. The farmyard where a boy once watched his father die has long since gone. Still, the grief that shaped a nation's memory, folded gently now into the soft dark of centuries past. The river at Stirling moves the way it has always moved, unhurried, indifferent to the armies that once crowded its banks, carrying nothing now but starlight and the quiet sound of water finding its own way home. Westminster Hall stands silent too, its stone cooled by time, the echoes of judgment long since faded into ordinary air. And Bannockburn's fields, where the war finally found its resolution, lie dark. And even under a wide, patient sky, the grass grown soft over ground that once bore the weight of history's turning point, let all of it rest now. The battles are over. The betrayals have settled into old, quiet sorrow. The legend has been told, and told well, and needs nothing more from you tonight than the gentle closing of your eyes. Feel your own bed beneath you, warm and still, so very far from muddy fields and cold stone halls. There is nothing left to fight tonight, nothing left to carry, only the soft, steady weight of your own breathing, slow and even, pulling you down into rest the way the tide pulls gently back from shore. The stars are dimming now, one by one, patient and unhurried. The world outside your window has gone quiet, and here in this safe and settled dark it is simply finally time to sleep. End of script. Sweet dreams.